Hoe maak je openbare plekken weer toegankelijk voor iedereen? Dat is de vraag waarmee wordt geworsteld. Hoe zorg je dat bewoners zich bij het proces betrokken voelen en graag willen terugkeren? Shruthi vertelt erover en over verschillende creatieve interventies in het district Maboneng. Zoals Sunday markets, murals en groenprojecten die het deel van de stad weer tot een fijne en veiligere plek maakten. Maar voor wie? Dat is de vraag. Shruthi Nair, please come on the stage. Have a very warm welcome. Excuse me for my, what is it, a little bit stumbly English, but I'm going to try to do my best.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
So,
Thank you for having me.
Sure. Yeah,
and speaking in English.
Yeah,
I've
great.
tried to follow you in Dutch in my head, and I think my brain's just like...
But you lived for a while in the Netherlands, I saw,
Yeah,
right?
I did. I actually lived... I was born in India. I grew up all over India, left when I was 3, moved to The Hague for 5 years. My mother studied at ISS. My mother was a single mom raising me in Holland at that time, which is like unheard of.
Yeah.
Moved back to India, and then I settled in South Africa when I was very young.
So for a period of 5 years.
Correct.
But no, any words? Do you know any words? Dutch words?
Ik kan een beetje spreken en mijn Afrikaans is baie goed.
Oh,
so
kijk,
I can listen and I can but don't ask me to have a cerebral, intellectual conversation with you in Dutch.
Okay.
It's not going to happen.
Okay. We won't do that. Okay, well, I want to start off actually with this first question that I have, and it's regarding public safety in the public area.
Sure.
Would you say placemaking is the most important and effective way to accomplish such a goal or purpose?
I think it's a very difficult word in the current climate because placemaking often places an emphasis on design and it doesn't place an emphasis on the end user. And I think it has to shift dramatically. Urban design is more about design than it is about urban, and urban is the people. So in many occasions, specifically back in South Africa and in our context, placemaking, it's problematic because it's nice to have beautiful things, but we need functional things in our cities.
It's problematic. So it's focused more on design over the people.
It's very complex in Johannesburg. Oh yeah, I got a screen here too. Sorry, that just makes me feel so much better. But this is Johannesburg. Welcome. I don't know if anyone's been to Johannesburg, but it's problematic in Johannesburg because Johannesburg, South Africa, has the highest unemployment rate in the world. It has the biggest statistics to do with gender-based violence. We have not recovered from the problems that were placed in our cities through apartheid spatial planning. The urban planners planned our cities to move black bodies out of the city and white bodies in the city. So placemaking is lovely and it's a great concept and it's needed, but we've got to find a way to combine it and have a collaborative outcome in terms of how it's used by the end user.
Well, we're going to talk about it later, more about it, but I want to start off with tell us a little bit more about you and how you came to Johannesburg. And
I mean, I grew up in India, the Netherlands, and South Africa. I did most of my schooling in South Africa.
Went to South Korea.
I've lived in 5 cities. 5 countries, 10 cities. I've been to 10 schools. I was very naughty, but I was a nomadic person. My mother was a single mother. She had to put bread on the table, took me around with her, and I'm lucky for it. And I landed in Johannesburg after teaching in South Korea for 2 years, paying off my student loans, but I trained as a visual artist, so I have a fine art degree. I realized I couldn't support my family and my father, my late father, like artists in South Africa are actually trust fund kids. So I don't know what I was thinking at the time to study painting and sculpture and photography, but it really did set the basis for my appreciation for beautiful and ugly things. And I'm actually a trained designer now, and I'm studying still to be an architectural technologist, and I'm working in Johannesburg, and I've lived in Johannesburg, in this city. I've lived in that building, I lived in that building, and this is Johannesburg. I mean, it's incredibly dense, and I've been there for 13 years. And I worked for the developers of the Maboneng precinct, which I will be speaking to you guys about. And I live there now with my 10-year-old and my 2-year-old.
Oh,
yeah.
Nice. Hey,
and my husband, sorry.
Whoa, forgot somebody in there. the company you work for, as it regarding the placemaking?
Perpetuity.
Perpetuity,
Yes.
For how many years you worked there?
So
the whole bunch,
I
right?
was the fourth person the CEO hired, and I was the last person on the ship when the company went under foreclosure. So they signed for bankruptcy.
What time period? Like
9 years.
9 years?
Yeah.
9 years?
So 9 years I lived and worked in this area. The highest murder rate in the country.
Yeah, and maybe that's good what you're saying. Like, can you tell us a little bit about the background of Johannesburg? Like, what kind of...
So I don't know how many people have been to Johannesburg. Yes. Okay, so you understand the complexities of that city. Only about 2% of this audience, but that's really good. It makes me feel like I can look at you and you and you and you. But Johannesburg is a mining city. It was founded about 100 years ago by the mining gold rush kind of guys that wanted to just come in and build and mine. And it's called Igoli. It's called the City of Gold. The vernacular way of terming that city is the place that you go and you make your gold. But it's also a city that has had loads of cases of urban sprawl. So when apartheid ended in 1994, businesses literally moved out. They were like, the white people in that city and all the businesses were like, had something that we call swart gevaar. So it was like, okay, now everyone's free and let me take my money and go and build myself a new city, which is now called Sandton, by the way. If you go to Johannesburg, you will visit Sandton, and that's where all the sort of banking centers are. It's the shiny, glossy sort of Dubai of Johannesburg. And the city couldn't handle. I mean, we're the youngest democracy in the world. Apartheid only ended in 1994. So you can't expect to hand over all the socio-political problems to people now and have them solve that and handle the density of the city. And it's an incredibly dense city. Major, migrant communities, but Johannesburg is specifically known as one of our municipalities that is suffering.
Yeah, but so because you were saying like in 1994, like apartheid ending, but the system didn't end. Like the legacy was still out there, and
no, because 1% of the country owns all the wealth. So I mean, I guess what the city struggles with now is major issues with public transport. So you've got major networks that aren't being used. The trains don't work because half of the time they're not being serviced and they're owned parastatally. Our mode of transportation is not the mode of transportation that you will use. Most working class black people will use something called a taxi, which is an informal combi. We call it a combi, like a van. Yeah. And they'll take it to and from their homes into the city. And that commute alone in the morning is like an hour and a half. But you got to take 4 taxis. And you got to pay like 30% of your salary per day on that taxi. And getting to that taxi might get you killed, raped, murdered in an accident. It's completely dystopian. So part of, I think, the problem with a lot of the problems that Johannesburg is facing now is that we don't actually have a sort of proper strategy. Well, the city's changing and it's shifting, but they're incredibly difficult to work with. I mean, I will talk for hours if you want me to talk for hours. But yeah, so black bodies still live out of the city, but there are enough working class citizens in the city to actually make it a livable space. And the only people that occupy the city are the people that can find apartments within this central CBD
business,
area.
Business district, yeah.
All the industrial buildings are sitting vacant. A lot of them are sitting empty. So developers are coming in, and perpetuity came in and thought that they would turn it into a hipster neighborhood. And I can...
Yeah, but the start of that, because it has to do with Maboneng.
Absolutely, yeah.
And what did perpetuity? What did they do?
What did they do? Okay, so I got to focus now and look at this clicker. So perpetuity basically started buying buildings in this area. So this is a snapshot of Maboneng. I would say that almost 100% of what you see in front of you, up until the bridge at the background, I don't know if you can see it running, over the space of 9 years, was developed by perpetuity. And when they actually liquidated, they ended up buying about 4 city blocks north. But in the liquidation process, the company that bought all the buildings in auction took that over and started developing affordable housing, which is what we always should have done, what they always should have done. So what Perpetuity would do is they would buy neighboring buildings and then convert them into apartments, retail on the ground floor, and then apartments up. Never new builds, so always trying to repurpose and refurbish the existing building, keep its heritage ideals strong. We always had to negotiate with the Heritage Council. And the business sort of structure was that there was, from the first floor to the top floor, a sliding scale. So the apartments on the first, second, third floor would be slightly cheaper apartments, and then from the top floor up, however floors it would be slightly bigger and more expensive apartments. And these apartments were for both something called sectional title, which means that each apartment is owned privately, and that was the kind of draw card. Perpetuity, they wanted to bring in young investors to invest, maybe Airbnb, maybe live in it for 3 or 4 years, and then move on. I mean,
and what year did it start exactly?
2000 end of 2009,
End of
and
2009.
we liquidated around between 2018 and 19 were the auctions.
Yeah, but starting in 2000 and 2010, the first years, was it an instant success, or how did it
Well,
evolve?
it definitely initially was a success because there was a controlled feeling in the public space through these placemaking exercises. So every building had its own security guards on the perimeter. There was a landscaping element that was included in the building and the construction. There were cleaners on the street, and everyone, all the service staff that were incorporated into this project over 10 years. And there were well over, let's say, 250 people from the community that were employed and still are employed, and more now, because it's densified by about triple since we started. Came in and, managed the streets. Otherwise, this area is the area, I mean, I've lived here for 10 years. I moved. I bought a 50 square meter unit with my husband. I fell pregnant with my first child. I moved to the second apartment. We moved, but in the 10 years that we lived here, my child and I have heard about 4 people shot to death outside our window. It's the truth. Because there are a lot of taverns in the area. And so walking in the area in South Africa, psychologically, if you visited, you don't really walk in certain areas and you walk in others. So, and you walk in probably 10% of the actual space that you could be walking. Yeah. You want to ask a question?
No, when it comes to the artisanal and the artists and the artistry and the market starting up, when did that happen actually? Like
we've got Market on Main, who are a couple, a husband couple, Jacques and Bradley. They now run the market. They are Love Josie and Black Coffee. Black Coffee, not the DJ, the designer. So they're a husband and husband duo. And we gave them a 100-year-old building with a beautiful courtyard, planted olive trees, and said, please, can you run a Sunday market? And we really wanted to bring people back into the city to show them that if the public space is taken care of, would you walk down the road and buy food and then end up at a rooftop?
But did you guys came up with these ideas yourself, or did you look at other cities and saw what was happening or what was working, or you were finding out yourself?
I don't know how to go back. Sorry.
No problem.
Oh gosh. Sorry, guys. I'll get better at this. No, we did it internally, but totally inspired on like business trips. So the directors would travel all over the world. Yeah. They'd also employ people like myself who've had a bit of global experience, lived in other cities, and we would workshop ideas. We would say, okay, this garage is sitting empty for the next 6 months. What can we do? Okay, let's give it to some artists. Let's get maybe a mural in return, and they can, they can have free ground floor garage space until we develop. Then when we develop, we can move them to the next building. So we often, like, empty buildings would be sitting empty. We would do the typical Seminole to gentrification story. Bring the artists in, make it beautiful, make people feel safe, and then also try and ensure that there's not such a veneer of security, because if you go to South Africa, you really, unless you're in Cape Town, and we call Cape Town another country. It serves 1% of the country. It doesn't serve the masses. So, like, you can't go to Cape Town and say you've been to South Africa. Come to Joburg. Oh. But Joburg has one of the highest private security stats in the world, because everyone stays indoors, electric fence, and if you want to go out, you're going to a shopping mall. So walking on the street in this city was at that point, like, no one would really do it locally. So, yeah.
You sounded like when you said about like bring the artist in. I've like sound critical, right?
I'm definitely not critical of that. I love free space for artists. I mean, I'm not against that at all. I think that there tends to be, again, that focus on design. So bring in the big artist and pay them a crazy budget, when you could be paying for toilets or like water for the community or like a basketball courts for the 500 children in the neighborhood. You know, like.
So why,
why do you need the, and I can definitely say this because I don't work for the company and it's liquidated, and my boss, my ex-boss actually knows that I'm doing this talk, and he sent me some of these images, and I have his blessing. He's now gone on to be
is being taped, right?
Superstar, he's a superstar developer still, he's doing great. I mean, over 100 people lost their jobs. It was quite a big thing. But I've lost my train of thought now. What did I want to say?
No, well, where does the government come in?
Oh my goodness, don't get me started on the government.
Yeah, I mean,
like,
in
there's
this story,
no participation. It's completely dystopian. It's incredibly difficult. But through projects like Maboneng and other pockets of the city that have tried to sort of start that, move the artists in, have rental at this rate, then develop a little bit, increase the rental, but keep it down enough for makers to make and producers to have, at least entrepreneurs and practitioners to have affordable space. It's all private sector. So with small examples like Maboneng, and there's an area called Braamfontein, there's a new area called Victoria Yards, which has the first off-the-grid bathroom, completely off the grid. So no black waste going out, gets composted and put back in. We actually saw something at the de Caval yesterday that was quite similar. Are giving the city ideas. So now the city is doing a lot of tactical urbanism projects with people who have been players in these areas in the city. Last year I did a project with the city. It was completely a pilot, but the fact that the city are even starting to do that with a slightly more responsible attitude. So there's a strong focus on community participation. You have to canvass the area, ask the right questions. Who lives here? What skills do they have? Can they get the bread and butter at the end of the day, instead of us outsourcing it to an artist who's going to charge like €500 for 2 days. You could be employing someone locally to do it and have a proper community participation process with it.
So, and you brought more photos?
Yeah, I've got a fair amount. I mean, this is just the example of some of the buildings that we used to, that the company I worked for would buy in the beginning, and then we would sort of convert it. This is the old 7-Up bottling factory. So when we unearthed and started our demolition and prep works, we got these really beautiful 7-Up bottles. And the sawtooth structure went on to become close to about 60 office units, quite small for new entrepreneurs. This is not a great picture, sorry. So now that's what it becomes.
Oh, wow.
So that's what we've kind of finished with and developed. So this is, you know, we planted those fever trees, we added lights. You know, street lights don't work. So all the spaces had this sort of privately funded public space benefit for all. The company I worked for, they built a lot of outdoor play areas, a fair amount of illegal lights that the city didn't actually end up figuring out, but we had to.
Yeah, and what is the situation now, would you say, in Maboneng?
So the situation now is that Maboneng actually, when the developer that I worked for, when we were active and before we liquidated, the word Maboneng, no one could really use it, right? So they owned the IP. So Maboneng was only the buildings that Perpetuity owned. As soon as the liquidation process happened, all the affordable housing developers in the area started putting the Maboneng brand on their, you know, in Maboneng, because they didn't own all the buildings. There were buildings that were in between that were owned by a private entity. There were buildings that were next to a building in Maboneng that maybe you had, but you weren't Perpetuity, so you couldn't actually advertise your apartments as, and now everyone has fair game. But to answer your question, statistically, right now, there are close to 4,000 new affordable residential units that are for the rental market. There are 3 affordable private school models that have opened, and it really is a neighborhood that it had to fail for it to succeed. Perpetuity had to liquidate for it to actually benefit the end user.
Okay.
Because the developer was developing for a yuppie market. You know, it was only targeted at an LSM of, let's say, we use life standard measure, so maybe 7, 8, 9, 10. When it really should, the end user of the city is the working class, the guy who really does want the 2,000 Rand apartment rental and wants to move his kids into a safer neighborhood.
Is there, would you say over these years, is there a big lesson that you've learned that you could share with the audience, that you say like, yeah, this is one?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a great believer in failing. I think you have to fail in order to figure out the kind of loose points or the porous areas. And you cannot work in an urban context and not have every single stakeholder represented. It just will not work. And that every single stakeholder should have enough of a say. And when it comes to public space that isn't privately owned, even more so. Privately owned buildings need to be regulated in terms of how they're built and how they impact the existing communities, but it's always going to be a struggle. But if there's representation and there are voices that are being heard, at least there's a dialogue. At least someone who feels like they don't have a say now knows that they do. And you have to corral the community. You can't do it without the community. Every single person has to be able to have a voice.
Talking about the dialogue, you actually, Donika, you have another question, but I want to ask the audience, are there any questions? Does anyone have a question? Because now is the time. If you want to ask something, just put your hand up, and then Donika, we start with you.
And then we'll stop.
No, it's okay.
You talk about rallying the community. How?
So for our Perpetuity didn't do it successfully. I can tell you that right now. That's why it didn't work. There's just far too many variables involved in why they failed. But some and a lot of it has to do with the fact that no one was going to buy a building or an apartment and turn it into, especially if you're buying for profit, in an area like this. So I think the developers saw a gap, but when they came in, they didn't canvas. There was no community. So in South Africa, when you have the city project that's sanctioned by the city, there's something called there's a community participation team that has to canvas the entire area. And Perpetuity didn't do it successfully, but I actually saw quite a good example of how it was done last year with the city. Every single database is basically made of every single stakeholder. It's normal canvassing and survey, and everyone has to have a representative. So if it's retailers or informal traders on the ground, they have like a public realm czar. There's actually there's an incredible Nigerian American public space urban designer in New York, Ibe. I'm not going to do justice. She's amazing. She believes in this concept of the public realm czar. So every stakeholder in whatever department they are, whether it's residential or trade, has like a mini council and then a czar, like a public realm czar, but in interdepartmental spaces. And in this project, we had a WhatsApp group, very, very analog. It got very, very intense. But people were asking questions, and that's what you want. You want those questions so that and you can figure out the common question very easily. Everyone has a phone. Everyone has the right to participate with a phone. And how do you do that more and more, where you feel, and I know WhatsApp groups maybe in 5 years' time won't exist, and there'll be something far smarter, like MailChimp WhatsApp for public space making. But you have to have, otherwise, if you still have a platform to voice your opinion and you're keeping it to yourself, there's something wrong. There's something amiss, and you've got to find people to encourage that out.
Questions? Please raise your hands if you have any questions. Oh, here, starting.
I was wondering, how do you look back on your work for the developer, you were saying the things we did were you would now describe it as typically things for gentrification. How do you look back on your own work for the company, and what do you take with you, or what did you take with you in your next?
It's a very good question, because I actually chatted to it about it with my sibling. I think that a lot of us have imposter syndrome. So, you know, at the time, I am a self-made...
Imposter syndrome.
Imposter syndrome, where we would raise things with the developer, and we would say, we need to do this, we need to do more of this, but your bottom line as a developer is never really going to be listening to what people on the ground are going to be saying. It's going to be what your financial controller is telling you. If I had the luxury to walk out of my job at certain moments, I would, but I have 2 kids. I was supporting my dad a little at the time. I needed a job, you know? And I think that imposter syndrome holds you in a space where you feel like you don't have a voice because you don't want to lose your job. It's as simple as that. And I think there were so many strong voices that did work for the company, that did raise quite a lot of like, okay, we need more public space for community projects. Although every single pavement we did really upgrade with seating, greening that was inclusive. No one was not allowed to sit anywhere. No, well, I lie, because there's an incredibly big homeless community in the city. We've got like close to, I think, 20,000 homeless people living just in the CBD itself. And what we'd always wanted to do was offer a bathroom. So for the Sunday market, we noticed that the traders on the street went from like 20 informal traders, and informal traders are not allowed on the street, so they get fined by the city, but it still happens because Johannesburg is dystopian. But all the traders would need bathrooms. Excuse me. All the sort of homeless and disenfranchised in the neighboring communities would come in on a Saturday to beg, and there's no bathrooms. And so all of our spaces, actually, you'd have to enter, and if you're a patron of the restaurant, you can use the bathroom, but not if you're just wanting to use the bathroom. It doesn't exist like that. Yeah. So those types of things, you know, we would allocate so much budget on design. They would allocate so much budget on, like, David Adjaye designing a building, Lot Ek designing a building, the top interior architects doing interiors, like
big names, a lot of money, but you could spend it otherwise.
This is a before and after. So that was opposite my house, and then that was what it turned into.
I have another question here. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Great.
Can I get a glass, just a little cup of water? My mouth is very dry.
Yeah, water's coming.
So first of all, I find it really interesting that in the beginning you mentioned what placemaking meant and how you wanted to transform that the content. So it shouldn't be about design, but it should be about people. And it's really interesting that placemaking here in the Netherlands, it is actually sort of that interpretation. The placemaking itself focuses less on design and more on people. So the word itself is also...
It's fluid.
And then what I find also really interesting is that Maboneng itself is a completely unsafe area. And as one private entity, perpetuity, came in, not only had the property, but also was focusing on public space, it created also places where people could walk at some places. Yeah. So there are a few good examples also. And maybe you could also tell a little bit more about Sunday Market, maybe also Skadistan.
Yes, sure.
Just a few that focuses also like specifically on public space and how you create a safe space in a place that was completely unsafe at the time.
Yeah, sure. Well, this next slide, that's very bad, and I apologize, and now I have to go back to it, so I apologize again. I will get there.
Skadistan, can you say something?
Sure. So Skadistan is an NGO that's started by Oliver Perkovich, who's from New Zealand, and he's the CEO and founder. It's a NGO that uses the medium of skateboarding to teach girl children how to use the skateboard, and then there's homework literacy. And it started in Afghanistan. We have a few centers in the Middle East, in Cambodia, in Bolivia, Kenya, and we perpetuity donated land to Skadistan, which was actually situated behind this building. I sat on the board of Skatistan for 5 years, and I was the chair of the South African board for 3. And our story is quite immense in the city because there's only one site in the city, and we've already got 1,000 beneficiaries through our door every day. If we're every week, sorry. So we've got 1,000 registered children from the inner city that come through, learn how to skateboard. There's after schools programs. And yeah, it just teaches through the medium of skateboarding. And now Joburg, interestingly enough, there's a whole lot of articles that have been circulating. Joburg has a skateboarding culture, but it's not male skateboarders. It's actually quite a few collectives of black female skateboarders, and that's important because it's a sport that's always been associated with punk and resistance, and punk is predominantly a white genre. I'm not going to get into etymology, but it's amazing that there are women that are now able to get from one end of the city to the other on their skateboard, and they're fine.
Yeah, I just we have time for one other question. I think there was here somebody. Oh,
Katie, give me a moment. Give me a moment.
There's a picture of Skatistan I'm trying to get to. Oh, these are so bad. Sorry, guys. They're all pixelated.
well, this is will be the last question. But if you have questions, I mean, you'll be around.
I'll
here,
be around.
Right? So, just.
Oh, there was a picture of Skatistan at the end. I'm very sorry.
When you lost your train of thought, you were telling us that you spoke to your past employer and you were going to tell us something proprietary, it seemed like. Do you remember what that was?
Oh, no, I asked him for some images because all of our laptops got taken and all of our servers were closed, and I lost 9 years of work. I couldn't even... Anyway. But he's actually gone on to be a very, very successful developer. So he's sort of developing this thing called the Black Brick Club. He's not the face of the company, obviously, because, to be honest, when perpetuity liquidated, I think everyone was just like, whoa, what happened? I think that a lot of us had Stockholm syndrome because we actually lived there, we worked there, we conceived our kids there, it was something that we really did believe in, and then when the company liquidated, obviously there's a whole lot of stuff. Oh, is this me doing this?
No,
Can you end on a secret?
So no, he landed on his feet. He's got 4 different buildings that he's turning into sort of Ace Hotel, Soho House sort of concept, and he's doing well, which is always the case.
I want to thank you for your talk here and for this.
Thank you for having me, guys.
Yeah,
I'm sorry
Shruthi
about
Nair,
my slides,
everybody.
but I have nicer pictures. You can come and talk to me.